Hey everybody, it's Mr. Mazzoro. Today, what I want to talk to you about is one of my favorite things to talk about, coevolution. Coevolution is when two animals evolve so closely together that when one begins to change, the other changes with it. In other words, it's two animals who basically depend on two types of organisms, it doesn't have to be animals, that who depend on each other so closely that changes in one dictate changes in another. And plants and their pollinators have co-evolved so that when you see traits of one, you can begin predicting traits of the other. You can look at some plants and understand, if you know what you're looking at, whether that plant is pollinated by an insect or pollinated by a bird or pollinated by a mammal. And that's what we're going to start talking about, what these traits are of insect pollinated flowers, how insects have co-evolved with flowers, how birds have co-evolved with flowers, and how mammals have co-evolved with flowers. And lastly, we're going to talk about groups of flowers that have co-evolved for no animal. They're instead wind pollinated, what wind pollinated plants look like. First, coevolution. What is it? Again, it's when evolutionary changes in one organism affect another. And flowering plants have evolved with their animal pollinators for so long, over 100 million years, that really you can look at a flowering plant and see how it changes and predict or see likewise changes in the animals that pollinate it. Hawaii is a good example. This is a Hawaiian flower called Leohi flower, and if I'm pronouncing that wrong, forgive me. And it's pollinated by a bird called an iiwi bird. Leohi flowers were very popular on Hawaii, but they were always very, very long. And in the early centuries of Hawaii, not early centuries, but early 1900s in Hawaii, overgrazing of goats and cows basically wiped all of these long Leohi flowers off of Hawaii and left only one species that they didn't like to eat, a Leohi flower that had a much shorter flower. It's this blue variety. And what you'll notice about iiwi birds is that the iiwi birds of today have beaks that are actually just as short as the flowers. And if you compare these iiwi beaks with iiwi beaks of 100 years ago that were pollinating those longer flowers, you'll notice that current day iiwi beaks are shorter, 3% shorter, than their relatives 100 years ago. Changes in the flower dictated changes in the pollinator. In this case, a shorter flower dictated a shorter beak. That's coevolution. Flowers have co-evolved with all types of pollinators, all types of animal pollinators. And you can look at traits in one and predict traits in another. For instance, insects, right? Insect pollinated flowers. What are some unifying traits and why do they have those unifying traits? Well, number one, most insect-pollinated flowers have blue or yellow petals, but not red. Why? Well, insects can only see blue or yellow. Insects are actually blind to red. They don't have the proper cells in their eyes that can register red. So, insect-pollinated flowers aren't red. That would be wasted. Next, insect-pollinated flowers usually have ultraviolet markings. You might not recognize this particular flower, but you definitely recognize this flower. This is a dandelion, and to us it's just a plain yellow flower. But if we shine an ultraviolet light on a dandelion flower, what you notice is that it actually turns into a pseudo bullseye with white petals around the outside and all of the business, the inner two whorls, the male and female carpels and stamens of the dandelion flower become this bright bullseye pink. Why would they have these ultraviolet markings that we can't see? Well, we don't pollinate dandelion flowers. We can't see it. They don't care about us seeing it. We don't pollinate them. Bees do, and bees can see ultraviolet light. So to a bee, this is what a dandelion looks like. To us, this is what a dandelion looks like. Coevolution. Last, flowers that are insect pollinated usually have a strong scent. Why? Because insects find their food through smell. Think of flies on garbage or flies on poop. This is a corpse flower. A corpse flower, or otherwise known as a dead horse arum, is called that because it smells like dead rotting meat. And that's because it's pollinated by the things that like dead rotting meat, flies. In fact, it has a red center just like the corpse of an animal. And on the petal itself, it has tiny little hairs to mimic the blood-soaked hair of an animal. So flies think that they're landing on a beautiful rotting corpse that they can lay their maggots in so that they have plenty of food once they hatch. And what they're doing is they're actually pollinating this corpse flower, this dead horse arum. Ophrys are actually insect-pollinated flowers taken to the extreme. Ophrys are types of orchids that are native to Australia. And ophrys don't only have all these characteristics, but they go one step forward of insect-pollinated flowers. Ophrys in this one area actually look like the female counterpart of the animal that pollinates them. They look like the female wasps or female bees of animals that pollinate them. And they also release scents that mimic the pheromones of a female wasp or a female bee when they're in heat. So you have all these male wasps flying around in Australia, and all of a sudden they see this thing that looks just like a female. It has a hairy petal that mimics the thorax of a female, a blue kind of gleam that looks like a wasp's wings in the light, and it smells like a female in heat. So the male wasps land on these ophrys and they try to have sex with these flowers. Eventually they figure out that they can't have sex with a flower. We've all learned that the hard way. But when they take off or in the act of having sex with the flower, they actually get some pollen on them. And then they fly around, find another flower, try to have sex with that one. It doesn't work, but boom, you get cross-pollination. So again, how did these flowers evolve to not only look but smell just like female wasps? Coevolution, right? Changes in one flower were closely mimicked by the changes in the animal species that were pollinating them. Birds. Birds also pollinate flowers, but birds aren't insects. So bird-pollinated flowers have different characteristics than insect-pollinated flowers. For one, the petals are usually orange or yellow or red. And the reason is because birds see orange, yellow, and red well. They don't see those other colors very well, the yellows and the blues of insect-pollinated flowers. Bird-pollinated flowers usually don't have a scent, and that's because birds can't smell. And last, bird-pollinated flowers usually have long tubular flowers because birds have long cylindrical beaks. And they usually produce nectar, which is a high caloric food because birds fly and all that exercise of flight needs to be rewarded with a very high calorie, very energy dense fuel. Mammals. Specifically here, not us, but bats. Flying mammals are the ones that are going to do most of the pollinating. So, mammal-pollinated flowers usually have small white petals. Why? Bats can't see, but so what's the plant going to do? Spending energy developing these huge, showy petals when bats are blind. Also, the flowers usually release strong smells of rotting fruit, and that's because bats eat rotting fruit, so that's the smells that they're going to be attracted to. Last, flowers that are mammal-pollinated usually produce lots of nectar because bats, like birds, fly. That's a very big exercise, and they need to be rewarded with a very energy-dense fuel in order to fuel their flight. So they need to be rewarded with lots and lots of nectar. How did flowers know this about bats, or how did bats evolve to know this about flowers? Well, again, coevolution. Small evolutionary changes in one dictated small evolutionary changes in another. Small evolutionary changes in mammals dictated small evolutionary changes in the way those flowers smell. There's lots of sexual reproduction. Flowers, some of them smelled like rotting fruit, others smelled like, let's say, perfume. The ones that smelled like perfume, bats didn't like as much as the ones that smelled like rotting fruit. All of a sudden, you get a pressure towards the reproduction of just these rotting fruit-smelling flowers, because that happens to be what bats eat. Bada bing, bada boom, you get coevolutionary development. There are other plants, some plants, that are wind-pollinated. They don't have an insect pollinator. You'll recognize these plants because they have small, colorless, scentless flowers. They don't produce lots of nectar because those are all the ways that flowers use to attract animal pollinators, and these plants don't have an animal pollinator. Instead, they put all of their developmental energy towards developing lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pollen. Because if you're wind pollinated, you can't control where the wind blows. So the more pollen you make, the more chances you have of actually getting your pollen from point A to point B and having successful pollination. Corn, as you see here, would be probably the most common wind pollinated flower that you see. All of these up there are wind pollinated, or are the wind pollinated flowers of corn. So that's that. What's coevolution? Coevolution is where changes in one organism affect changes in another. Flowers co-evolved with insects because insect-pollinated flowers usually smell, because insects find their food through smell. They usually have ultraviolet markings because insects can see ultraviolet light. And they're usually colors like yellow or blue because insects see yellow or blue. Flowers co-evolve differently to birds because birds have different characteristics. Flowers that are bird pollinated have cylindrical flowers because birds have cylindrical beaks. They are usually scentless because birds can't smell. And they are usually red or orange because birds see red or orange. Mammal pollinated flowers produce lots of nectar. They smell like rotting fruit. And they have small dull white flowers because the mammals that pollinate them, bats, are blind. So the petals aren't going to be the things that really attract the bat. Wind-pollinated flowers are a little bit different. Wind-pollinated flowers have none of these traits. They don't have large petals. They don't have strong scents. They don't reward their pollinator with nectar. Instead, they've put all of their developmental energy into developing as much pollen as they can. Because this way they dump as much pollen into the wind, and since they can't control where the wind blows, it increases the likelihood of successful pollination. That random pollen grain blowing around in the wind, landing on a female flower. That's it for today. Tomorrow, in the next chapter, we're going to talk to you about the actual process of pollination, the actual process of transferring pollen from point A to point B.